Today we hear about Hannah and her story of wanting desperately to have a child. And she was married to a man who loved her dearly, and because of the circumstances of that day and age and building up the kingdom of Israel, the people of God, it was really important to have children. And so a man would take a second wife if the first one did not bear children. And that is why those two women are sharing one husband. And although his second wife was able to have children, there was still a lot of jealousy there, which we hear about in this story. She was bothered by how much their husband still loved Hannah. And so she really gave her a hard time. She really, kind of gloated about the fact that she had kids and Hannah did not. And it was a deep place of wounding for Hannah. And so she was praying. She offered many, many prayers to God in the temple. And Eli saw her praying and thought maybe she was not sober, and so chastised her. But when he found out how deep her longing was and how wounded she felt, he blessed her and sent her on her way. And she made a promise to God in her prayers that should she bear a son, she would offer him to God for God's work. And in that day and age, one could make a promise like that, but then once the child was born, she could fulfill that promise by actually making a payment to the temple. She could pay instead of actually giving her son over. But she honored that promise. And this is the birth story of Samuel, who we hear from today. And what's amazing to me is it is the most incredible example of how God's vision can take quite some time to unfold. Because Hannah had Samuel, who then became David's mentor and counselor. And David, of course, became king of Israel. Samuel actually anointed him privately before the people did. And then, of course, he became king of Israel, which became the lineage of Jesus. And so here we are, Hannah, who desperately wants a child. And 1,000 years later, the birth of that child helped influence Jesus and his being. And we saw in our second lesson, or in what's the psalm today, it's Hannah's song of praise for having had a child, and it mirrors quite some bit Mary's Magnificat, her song of praise when the angel tells her that she will bear a son. So Hannah had no idea in those prayers and in the fulfillment eventually of that prayer for this one child, that would ultimately lead to Jesus. And here we are now, another 2,000 years later. Hannah had no idea that we would all be here doing these things. And so 3,000 years after Hannah is so desperately praying, the church stands. And it's a really, to me, comforting reminder that as we look around in the world and things may not be unfolding the way we hope they would unfold, people may not be acting as lovingly as we hope that they will, as welcoming of the stranger, as generous of heart and spirit as we would like, and even as kind as maybe we would hope our interactions might be. We don't know how this is unfolding. All we can do is be faithful in this moment. One of the things that we hear a lot is delineations, things that are defining us, immigrant or natural born, rich and poor, white or non-white. And, we hear about Christians and non-Christians and all of these things. And I think that all we can do is not worry so much about the labels, but worry about our being. And worry is maybe not the right word, but be concerned about our being. So rather than moving through the world asserting, I am a Christian by title, it's, am I behaving as a Christian? Am I behaving as someone who follows Jesus? and lives into his teachings. And in particular, the great commandment of loving God and loving our neighbor as ourselves. And also, I think there's a lot to be gleaned from the Sermon on the Mount that really shows us the different ways in which we are blessed. And Hannah had that experience of being an outcast, right? Or an outsider. She so wanted to have a child, and it didn't happen. And for me, that's a real source of compassion for her and her struggles. I think we all have a way of connecting with others in their suffering that feels kind of deeper and more genuine than maybe just our flippant response to someone who is just having a bad day or whatever. I think that we all have had experiences of things not turning out the way we had hoped they would, whether that's bearing a child or marrying the person we had hoped to marry, or our marriage not lasting as we had originally hoped, of having a friendship that had fallen apart, an estrangement, of losing a job. I mean, we've all had disappointments. And I think compassion is one of the best gateways for having soft hearts. For me in particular, I've been thinking so much about Hannah this week. I too really struggled with having kids. Ultimately Hannah had 5 children and had a lot to rejoice. I do have 3 kids, and I've been pregnant 8 times. I mean, I did not have trouble getting pregnant, but I had trouble actually birthing those babies. So I had 4 miscarriages and 1 child who was born still, and his name is actually Samuel. And we just don't know sometimes what other people are struggling with or suffering, and yet again, it is such a gateway for soft hearts and compassionate spirits. And I think that is what is going to, for lack of a better word, kind of save us in this time. We hear some of this apocalyptic language in today's gospel lesson about the birth pangs of the world. And I think we have all experienced those things. And I don't know about you, but I really relate to those disciples saying, just tell us how long. Like, how long is the hard stuff going to last before we get to the good stuff? I experienced that in labor, right? Just tell me how long this is going to last, and then I'll pace myself. Like, I'll just, if you just tell me it's another 8 hours, that's great. I can do it. The I don't know was really hard. And again, though, we look at Hannah, here we are 3,000 years later, and we are the benefits of her fruit. The things that she did as a result of her faithfulness and her gift to God and the gift of her son, who was gifted to her by God. I mean, God's just love for us just flows and flows and flows. And my hope is always that we can somehow figure out how to stand in that stream of love so that we can help it flow as well. And again, just being so compassionate as I think the way to do it, and to recognizing that looking around in the moment, things may not appear as we had hoped, and all we can do is show up. Show up in love, show up in prayer, show up in faithfulness, show up in ways that the world is so hungry for, and we're hungry for it too. I heard Father Greg Boyle in a podcast this week. He's the one who did Homeboy Industries, which helped with youth who were incarcerated and homeless, helping them be more engaged in the world and having a better trajectory for their lives. And he used a quote which I've heard by other people, and he was saying, one of the things we have to remember is we belong to each other. And it gave me pause, because I used to love that phrase so much, right? This idea that we are so connected, that what happens to you happens to me. We're all interwoven, intertwined. And someone very graciously taught me differently. I have a lot of privilege, and in my family line, we have never belonged to anyone. As far as I know, we have not been slaves. And there are many people of color and other socioeconomic status, of life circumstances in which the idea of belonging to someone is actually a reality. And so instead, I would like us to think about the idea of we are one body. We really are. We hear that in all of our literature, in Scripture. We hear that in our lessons. We experience that at the Eucharist at the table, one body, one blood. And I think it's another gateway to compassion. Because again, when a part of me is struggling, when a part of my body is hurt, I don't just, well, sometimes I do. I was going to say ignore that part of my body, but let's be honest, sometimes I do and just hope it will go away. But ideally, we actually care for that part of our body with a little extra compassion and attention and whatever is needed to offer healing and restoration. And I think that is another one of our gateways, is thinking about where in the world is our body struggling. Our body here in this community, our body in Denver, our body as the church, the Episcopal Church with capital E and capital C, and the body of the world, of all of creation, the earth, the animals, the plants, the people, everything is all part of this body. And we need to look for where there is suffering. And it doesn't mean that everybody can do everything, right? I've talked before, the ear doesn't pretend it can see and be the eye. The hand does not, try to digest the food. Like, each part of the body has its own role, and we need to acknowledge that, but also help heal and care for, to recognize, if our foot is lame, we are all suffering. If we are struggling in one place, it significantly impacts what's happening for all of us. And so my invitation to you, as always, because I'm constantly trying to think, how can I actually live into this, is to think, when I don't know what else to do, I can pray. Prayer matters. It is our good and holy work. Where can I find sources of compassion where my heart can be soft and I can offer some welcome or some healing or some care? And sometimes that's to myself. Maybe I'm really struggling with something that's going on, and that compassion needs to be turned inward so that I can recognize that I'm beloved even in my own struggle. And sometimes we turn that out to the people sitting next to us, to the folks on the street, to the stranger, whoever it may be, that we can remember we are connected, we are one body, and we may not know what's going to happen next. We have this illusion that because it's in the calendar, or because, I always have lunch at noon, that's what's going to happen. But we really don't know. And so trusting that God is in it with us, that we are in it with one another. We don't know how it's going to unfold, and yet love will always show us the way, and love overcomes fear, and we can do it together.